Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Today we're going to be talking about the Washington State Department of Licensing and how they register illegal voters in Washington State. Okay, we're going to be talking about election integrity in Washington State. And as everybody knows, we're in the middle of a pandemic, the endless lockdown that will never end. And I want to point out, just as a trigger warning to everybody watching this video, that nothing I say today is going to be approved by Governor Inslee's Ministry of COVID Compliance. So even though it has nothing to do with COVID or anything else, I am sure that this lockdown orders, these rules seem to make it hard for us to talk about anything when it comes to election integrity in the state as well. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to be talking mainly today about the Washington State Department of Licensing, which is located in Olympia, Washington. They actually share the same building with the Washington State Attorney General's office, and I know this because sometimes I have to go there and serve legal documents on them, and you walk in, it's the same place. They have reception, kind of dueling reception areas in the lobby, and they share the elevator bank going up. And this is a big department. Now, when I talk about Department of Licensing, most people just think trying to go get your driver's license, or maybe if you grew up in Washington State, that's where you went and got your driver's test. That's where I got my driver's test. And that's usually how we interact with the Department of Licensing. Long way to the DMV. Not very fun, and the question is, what does this have to do with election integrity? Most of us just think about this is all where we get our license. So what people oftentimes forget or don't realize is that in Washington State, the Department of Licensing actually has everything to do with elections because they're the ones who register most people to vote in Washington State. And recently there was a hearing on August 29th, just earlier this year in Skagit County, and it was we had Patty Johnson, who was a former Washington State Department of Licensing employee, 19-year veteran, and worked for the state for about 30 years, recently retired. And she really had some amazing stuff to tell from her experience there, longtime experience as an employee at the Department of Licensing. And mostly it had to do with the fact that the Department of Licensing was aggressively pushing people who were not allowed to vote. Even those who knew they weren't allowed to vote, they were signing them up to vote anyway, regardless, non-U.S. citizens and other things. And I think it's kind of important to remember that this all goes back to the motor voter law, which was passed at a federal level in 1993. Bill Clinton signed it. He was very proud of that fact. But Washington State, as always when it comes to election stuff, is usually first to be worst. And we were focused on motor voting even before even before President Clinton decided that he would try it himself once he got in the federal office. So ultimately what this means is that we have a lot of people who get registered at the Department of Licensing. However, not everybody is supposed to be registered to vote. Just because you live in Washington State doesn't mean you're allowed to vote. And I'm going to point out that there are some people that are not allowed to vote under any scenario in Washington State. This is both federal and state law that would be illegal if they voted. Dead people, for example, even in Seattle, that's frowned upon. Pets, plants, inanimate objects, as much as the environmental movement may want to register them to vote and tries to on a very frequent basis. Convicted felons, for example, they're not supposed to be able to vote unless they've gone through a process to rehabilitate themselves. And non-U.S. citizens. And this doesn't mean illegals, which is usually the drama that gets pulled into this discussion. In Washington State, we actually have a lot of green card holders, student visas, H-1B visas, which are people who work for Amazon or Microsoft or some of the tech companies here. It's very common that they live here, and none of these people are supposed to be able to vote. And a lot of them know that, and we would go into the Department of Licensing and say that they knew they weren't supposed to vote. And yet, despite that, according to testimony, they were registered to vote, even when they didn't want to vote. And I'm going to tell you before I play this clip, because I want you to hear it specifically from the whistleblower herself. The thing about this is that this is a very pernicious sort of thing to do to these people, because especially if they're here on a student visa or they're hoping to become a U.S. citizen, registering to vote against their will, and even if they say or they don't believe that they should be registered to vote, getting them registered to vote anyway puts them in potential legal jeopardy in the future. If anybody's actually paying attention, it can actually prevent them from becoming a U.S. citizen. It's a crime. It really puts them in some kind of jeopardy. So the Department of Licensing isn't doing anybody any favors with this, and this is a terrible policy. And I want to point out, in this case, at this hearing in Skagit County, the person asking the question is Representative Jim Walsh, who's from the 19th Legislative District, and he was one of the representatives who was there listening to some of these whistleblowers testify in Skagit County earlier this year.
Just to be crystal clear, your testimony is that employees of the Department of Licensing and supervisors at the Department of Licensing knowingly register illegal voters.
Yes, yes.
So there you have it. And of course, there's a lot more to her testimony. I do link to the entire video. It's on Rumble. It's linked down below. YouTube censored this video originally. You can look at it for yourself and decide if you can even figure out why they would have censored it. But it is a good testimony, and it's somebody from the inside. Now, she's not the only one who works at the Department of Licensing who's come to me with this information. I've heard similar stories like this for years now from a variety of other employees. She's the first one who's willing to go public with that. But I think that it's probably about time that we come in and start fixing some of these issues. Now, we can't just assume that somebody else is going to fix it for us. Bob Ferguson, who in theory is the guy that you would expect to enforce state law and maybe even federal law locally, is absolutely never going to do that. He is happy to watch law breaking occur right underneath his nose, right down the hallway, and there's no way you're going to have anybody in the AG's office actually enforce the law, again, so close. These are people that they go to Marconi's to get a sandwich together or walk around Capitol Lake if they can dodge the drug needles and the drug addicts down there. They do this stuff together. These are employees who are probably fairly close to each other in different agencies. Highly unlikely they're actually going to do anything to enforce the law. So we really have a situation here where we need a lot more exposure on this and a lot more pressure for them to actually fix clear defects in the system. And because the Department of Licensing is so reckless and ridiculous about how they register simply everybody that comes and does anything, as you heard from the testimony, if you go in and get a photo there, they'll register you to vote, no matter how many times you've already been registered to vote. That's how you have people like this that end up with 12 ballots coming to them, and they're wondering, how did that happen? Well, the Department of Licensing, every single interaction you have with them, they just seem to keep registering you to vote. That's one of the reasons also why we have so many extra ballots floating around all the time. But of course, there's nothing to see here. Everybody in charge will tell you there's nothing to see here. Nothing to see. Nope, not a problem, nothing going on. And I think that most people could look at this and start to realize that we're going to have to look a lot closer and understand what's happening and come up with some reasonable solutions to the problems that we're uncovering. Which leads to one of my favorite topics, and one of the reasons why I created We the Govern in the first place, is that whistleblowers are needed. We need more people who are willing to come forward. Patty Johnson shouldn't be the only one willing to go on the record. Those half a dozen or so people who've come to me from the Department of Licensing over the years and who have brought up similar concerns, it might be time for you to start going on the record if you're retired, perhaps, you don't want to lose your job, or if Inslee fires you because you didn't get the jab, or whatever reason. But if you have inside information and documentation, please come forward. We got to fix these problems. There's no reason for us to continually have issues like this going on. There's no excuse for that in Washington State. So if you want to learn more about this, I do encourage you to go to the description section below. I do have a number of links down there that might be helpful and insightful for those who are interested in learning more about this topic. And I encourage you to go to wethegovern.com to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe to this video channel and share it with others. The more who know, the more likely it is that we can fix some of these problems. And remember, the future belongs to those who show up.